My name's Peter Ramsay, and I'm one of the founders of the Full Brexit, and I'm going to chair tonight's discussion. If there's one overriding reason for the Full Brexit's existence, it's democracy. I think for all of us, those of us who started it and support the Full Brexit may disagree about many things, but I think we agree that leaving the European Union was a necessary condition for the restoration of accountable government in Britain, or the achievement of accountable government in Britain, of a government that is accountable to the citizens. The way that Brexit is connected to that, and the way that it's doing that, is certainly unexpected and paradoxical. We saw that at the general election last year, where the Labour Party, the crumbling of the Labour Party's domination of the north of England, produced a Tory government dependent on the votes of working class voters in the Red Wall. And that Tory government now finds itself wrangling with the European Union, not so much about free trade as about state aid as a consequence. So leaving the European Union was a way of bringing government back closer to ordinary people, and setting the expectation that government should be accountable to us. However, I think we'd agree, perhaps people differ on this, that Brexit was only ever a necessary condition for this, not a sufficient condition. And no sooner had we left the European Union than along came COVID. And some of us wrote in March on the Full Brexit website that with COVID, we could certainly say that we were not in control of government. Our representatives, Parliament, have simply departed the field, and although there's some stirrings on the Tory backbenches, we haven't heard very much from Parliament. Nor, it seems, is the government in control. That seems apparent from what's happened in the last 6 months. The experts who the government hide behind, they completely disagree about what the right things to do are, and we are stumbling on through this with plenty of regulations, but no capacity for political judgment. The future for democracy looks still shaky, to put it mildly. So tonight's discussion, we hope it will be the first of more, and tonight's discussion is intended to address the question of democracy in Britain, and how we might advance the cause of democracy and our control over government. Tonight, we thought we'd focus on the Constitution and on the Union in particular. And we have another panel of Full Brexit heavyweights for you. I'm coming from, as you can see, the well-appointed corporate headquarters of the Full Brexit in central London, but dotted around the country, we have our panelists. Pauline Hadaway is a researcher in Irish studies at the University of Liverpool. Richard Tuck is a professor of government at the University of Harvard, and I think it's fair to say, one of the leading historians of political thought in the English-speaking world. And Martin Loughlin is a professor of public law at the London School of Economics, and one of the leading constitutional theorists in the English-speaking world. Curiously, all of us, it's a bit of a northern mafia tonight, though I probably don't sound like it. We all hail from the northeast of England, perhaps the geographical hinge of the Union, 2 from Northumberland, 2 from County Durham. I'm going to chair. Each of the panelists is going to speak for 15 minutes, and then we'll have a Q&A. If you would like to ask a question to the panel in the Q&A, there are going to be 2 ways you can do that. You can put your hand up in the, you just put your hand up using the raise hand function, which you'll find at the participants button. If you click on the participants button, for those of you who haven't used Zoom, I'm sure you will have, and put your hand up and I will take them in order, people who put their hands up to ask questions. Alternatively, there's a Q&A button at the bottom. If you click on that, You can type your question there. I'll see the questions that you put there and pass them on. You can vote, I believe, for questions there if you like that question, and that will push it up to the top of the list, and I'll take the questions at the top of the list. So that's how we're going to do it. I'll remind you of that when the panelists have finished. But to start, I'll ask Pauline Hadaway to kick us off. Over to you, Pauline.
That's it. Hi there. I'd like to start with the current controversy surrounding the Internal Market Bill and the claims that the British government is reneging on the Northern Ireland protocols in the EU withdrawal agreement. And this turns on the question of whether Britain should be able to implement its own rules and procedures for managing the movement of products from Great Britain to Northern Ireland, that is within the UK internal market, and whether the European Court of Justice should have jurisdiction over state aid where this affects trade between Northern Ireland and the EU. And the issue at stake is whether to draw the new customs border between the EU and the UK along the existing partition border or around the island of Ireland. And I don't intend to look into the rights and wrongs of the bill or to examine the Northern Ireland protocols in detail, because I'm more interested in the fundamental question, which has dogged the Brexit negotiations from the start. What is the nature of British sovereignty in Northern Ireland? And the current war of words about where to draw the customs border highlights the extent to which Brexit has unsettled Britain's well-established modus operandi for governing in Northern Ireland. And it's also brought the international dimension of that conflict out into the open. And perhaps most unsettling of all, it's a reminder that the British-Irish conflict is unresolved, and that it was and primarily remains a national conflict. It's a dispute about sovereignty, territory, and state power. So I'd like to talk a little bit about the British state's modus operandi for government, because I think it's very interesting. I think it's also very informative and instructive for people in Britain to think about this. And I think also Northern Ireland is not only a case study for how the British state governs, but it's also a warning from history about the importance of democracy and the meaning of sovereignty. So I think the British state's way of governing in Northern Ireland has always been shaped by an insistence on its role as a sort of weary onlooker, as if Ireland's problems sat outside of history and beyond its control. And in February 1922, famously, following Ireland's War of Independence, which led to partition, Winston Churchill separated the weightiness of Britain's responsibilities on the international stage from the burden of managing the petty domestic quarrels on its home ground, when he said, "The whole map of Europe has been changed, but as the deluge subsides and the waters fall short, we see the dreary steeples of Fermanagh and Tyrone emerging once again." And 50 years later, following the disintegration of the Unionist state, successive British governments adopted the same exasperated tone, bemoaning their role as honest brokers, appealing for harmony between the warring tribes of Unionists and Nationalists as they were drawn reluctantly further and further into direct responsibility for the government of Northern Ireland. And this insistence that Northern Ireland must remain in the Union by any means, and simultaneous denial of responsibility, is expressed in the formulation that's reiterated by successive British governments since it's been reiterated since the partition of Ireland. And that is that Northern Ireland should not cease to be part of the United Kingdom without the consent of the people of Northern Ireland, the border is not an issue. Well, there are a number of issues in this assertion. The border is, was, and remains a key issue. And this question of who are the people of Northern Ireland is another issue. Because after partition, politics could never be framed around assumptions of a single unified political community or demos who could be said to represent the people of Northern Ireland. And Northern Ireland came into existence through the denial of democracy in Ireland. Ireland's first national parliament, established after Sinn Féin's victory in the 1918 UK general election, which was the last all-Ireland election and the first to be held under near universal adult suffrage. And far from being a petty domestic quarrel, the decision to act on the democratic mandate for self-determination in Ireland was unprecedented in the history of the British Empire. And it was part of that wave of revolutionary and democratic movements that swept the world after 19, as populations, conscious of the fragility of the old imperial powers, became conscious of their own history-making power. And as the Irish President Michael D. Higgins made plain in a recent speech marking the 100th anniversary of the Black and Tan attack on Balbriggan, the imperialist strategy that unleashed a policy of military terrorism on the people of Ireland after 1919 was not limited to Ireland, but was used against popular uprisings in India, Kenya, and Cyprus. So I think it's not controversial to say that the government of Northern Ireland was closer to a colonial administration than a modern democratic state. The government gave itself coercive powers, including powers of internment without trial, and it exercised its authority through an armed police force backed up by paramilitary B specials. And when the popular revolt came, the people who marched for civil rights and one man, one vote in Belfast and Derry were inspired by the Black Civil Rights Movement of the 1960s in America. And the later provisional IRA campaign was shaped by the national liberation movements of the 1960s and 1970s. So I think whatever the British state may say, however much it may deny it, Ireland's history has always been shaped by international developments. And so when the British electorate voted to restore national sovereignty from the EU in 2016, the demand to take back control expressed widespread feelings of disaffection and political alienation, but also a very powerful aspiration that the people should govern. And inevitably, and I think this is really telling, inadvertently, this brought questions about sovereignty, territory, and state power back into the political spotlight in Britain and Ireland. And I think the question then of where we go, where Ireland and Britain go after Brexit, I think again we have to think about the historical context. Because just as Ireland's history was central to the history of the 20th century, so after 1989, Ireland's political future has been shaped by the end of history. And the collapse of the grand narratives of socialism and republicanism and the left-right framings of liberal modernity and the decentering of the human subject as a rational agent capable of self-government through the act of knowing and shaping the external environment. All of this has shaped, I think, the settlement that led to the Good Friday Agreement, which began with the Downing Street Declaration of 1993, where Britain declared that it had no selfish or strategic interest in Northern Ireland, and through pooling sovereignty with its Irish partners and operating within the stabilizing framework of an ostensibly borderless European Union, Britain was finally able to realize its long-standing ambition to govern in Northern Ireland indirectly, remotely, and without responsibility, and to say that the border is not an issue. I think the 1998 agreement has been seen as marking, if not the end of Irish history, at least the end of Irish political modernity, where the great ambition to construct a national political community that might unite Catholic, Protestant and dissenter has given way to the management of particular identities and interests through the politics of power sharing and processes of peace building. And the Good Friday Agreement is a very postmodern settlement in this respect, and very much in keeping with our times. It's not a settlement so much as a continuous process through which the former parties to this conflict agree to put aside their mutually incompatible political goals in order to stay in the process and to keep the process moving. And yet, in spite of all its weaknesses, the Good Friday Agreement is surprisingly resilient. It is, I think, resilient because it is of its time. It represented a significant moment of historical change. It achieved many positive practical outcomes for the people of Northern Ireland and Ireland. And after 3 decades of violent conflict, all the parties committed to enter the process of demilitarization and to ensure a return to normal security arrangements. And Britain agreed to dismantle the securitized state and reduce its military presence, especially along the border. And the agreement succeeded in drawing the exhausted, but still potentially lethal provisional movement into political dialogue and opened the door to Sinn Féin's entry into the structures of government. And this ultimately saw all the main paramilitary groups signalling their willingness to put down their weapons and agree terms for the release of prisoners. And this brought about long overdue reforms in the administration of security, policing and justice. So it did so much, and I think above all it spoke to a widely held and deeply felt longing to end decades of bloodshed in Ireland. But it failed to resolve the fundamental question of sovereignty, territory and state power. And of course it further muddied the water with its complicated formulations of citizenship and belonging, invoking the people of the island of Ireland, the people of Ireland, north and south. And of course, it was designed really to affirm unionists' desire for continued identification with the United Kingdom, whilst acknowledging the rights of Northern nationalists to identify as Irish and enjoy equality with the unionist identity. And in that way, it frames politics around the old internal intercommunal quarrel. But however, and I think this is very important, what it has done is to signal a novel and far-reaching redefinition of the political category of citizenship, from state citizens occupying a defined political territory and shared jurisdiction to an amorphous conception of cultural nationality assumed as a matter of personal identity on the basis of shared heritage or cultural membership. And I think this takes us to a very strange place when we say, has Brexit opened the door to Irish unity? Has it broken the link between Britain and Ireland? Because the question really is, well, what would a unified Ireland look like? And in what sense would breaking the link between Britain and Northern Ireland change anything very much? The agreement actually sets out, in spite of the fact that it sort of liberates citizens from the judicial and territorial constraints of state citizenship, The agreement actually sets out a very rigid institutional framework for mandatory power sharing in which the choice is limited to variations of British Unionist and Irish nationalist identity. And the people of Ireland are still separated by a supposedly invisible border that runs between the north and south, but they're actually physically separated too by barriers known as peace walls that run internally through villages and towns and cities, and even break up streets into Catholic and Protestant sides. So I'd like to just finish really by saying that yes, Brexit has had an unsettling effect on Britain's authority to govern in Northern Ireland, and that inevitably, I think, it calls the authority of the state into question in Britain as well. And thinking about where we want to go next, or where we think Ireland may go next, I would like to challenge assumptions then that Brexit has opened the door to a united Ireland. I think it's rather exposed the hollowness at the core of British sovereignty in Ireland, but also the hollowness of the political parties, and perhaps the hollowness of us, the citizenry, who cannot translate our yearning for change into a movement for taking back control. So I'd also like to challenge the impatience that many British people have expressed during the course of the Brexit negotiations. You know, seeing those dreary steeples coming back into view, we tend to say, oh, for God's sake, Ireland, or Northern Ireland, or whatever it is you call yourself, just get on with it. You can go now. But I think it's really important to remember that the future of Ireland and Northern Ireland is ultimately subject to the wishes of the British Secretary of State for Northern Ireland, who will decide whether or not to call a border poll. But I think also, more importantly, the questions that we are now confronting here in Britain, questions of sovereignty, national territory and state power, are the same questions that the people of Ireland and Northern Ireland have been confronting for decades. The question of who do we acknowledge as the people with whom we will work to build a common future? On what basis do we come together to make laws and share resources? And how do we cooperate with others within our political and national communities and with our neighbours? And I think the only way to begin to answer these questions is to start asking them of ourselves and of each other. These are not questions that will be solved by trade deals and customs treaties, or that can be managed within regulatory frameworks imposed from above. And so I'd like to end by saying that we must not fall into the trap of denying reality. We must confront the problem of moving on from a yearning for democracy to a realization of it. And if we fail to do that, it is an abandonment of democratic politics and a betrayal of the future.
Thank you, Pauline. Thanks very much for bringing up the general themes from the Northern Irish experience. Next, we have Richard Tuck. Richard.
That was extremely fascinating, Pauline, and also leads quite neatly, I think, into some things I wanted to say. I was going to begin talking a bit about the other element in what used to be the British Union, that is to say, the union with Scotland, since that also is something which I think Brexit has, the issues over which Brexit has opened up in a number of ways, some not necessarily in the direction you would expect. And I was very much taken with Pauline's remarks at the end about how we shouldn't suppose that, so to speak, the naive response of many commentators to Brexit and the future of the Union is the correct one. And I think we should begin by remembering something which is again also relevant to what Pauline was talking about, which is that until the 1980s, Scottish nationalism and the Scottish National Party was extremely opposed to European Union. And in fact, I think they were the most violently opposed of all the various political parties in Britain and Northern Ireland, and indeed in the Republic of Ireland as well, actually, dealing with the question of whether Britain should go into the EEC. And that makes perfectly good sense if you think about it, because after all, they were committed to the independence of this small country. And what's the point of having a small country that's independent and immediately allows itself to be swallowed up by a much larger unit? Perfectly logical position that the early SNP people took up. The snag about it, of course, from their point of view, was that they didn't actually have very much electoral success. And Peter mentioned that we all actually come from the northeast of England, and I can remember as a boy that the main activity of the SNP was moving the signs that said "Welcome to Scotland" from the north of Berwick-upon-Tweed to the south of Berwick-upon-Tweed, and that was about as far as their political activity went. That changed in the 1980s, when, partly under the influence, ironically, of Jim Sillars, who later flipped back in this respect, but at the point at which he moved over to the SNP, they decided to abandon their commitment, their opposition to the European Union, and instead to embrace it. And immediately, pretty well immediately, their electoral fortunes started to rise. I think the same is true, though Pauline could say more about Sinn Féin, which of course was also very opposed to the European Union at the time of the 75 referendum, and again switched about the same time, I think, and no doubt for somewhat similar reasoning, which is this, perfectly straightforward, that membership of the EU rendered independence for Scotland, and as Pauline said, a certain kind of arrangement in the island of Ireland costless. That all the benefits which Scotland had gained from the Act of Union, the economic integration with England, while maintaining a significant separateness in other respects, and I'll mention something about that later when we come on to the question of the present COVID crisis, but it would retain all the benefits that it gained from the union with England in 1707, because they are precisely the benefits of economic integration. And under the EU, the economic integration was maintained, free movement of peoples, etc., etc. There was absolutely no cost to Scottish independence as long as both England and Scotland were in the EU. And perfectly reasonably, the Scottish electorate understood that, and came pretty close to voting for independence, deterred by a number of important considerations, largely currency. But even the currency is, I think, a relatively minor issue. And my guess would have been that had Great Britain stayed in the EU, another run of the Scottish independence referendum would have most probably led to a vote for independence. However, we've had Brexit. And one of the things that in various publications I actually said would happen with Brexit is it would be that Scottish independence would become a much more difficult enterprise. So again, this fact that both the EU had acted as a kind of overarching structure within which different sorts of political arrangements could take place in a relatively costless fashion, that once that structure had gone, all sorts of other possibilities arise. But in the case of Scotland, at least I predicted, it would be harder for Scots to vote for independence, since for the first time, well, the first time really ever, at least for a modern state, there would be a border. I mean, obviously there was a border in the late Middle Ages and 16th century, all the famous border reivers and so on. But it wasn't a border like a modern border with customs controls, control of movement of peoples and so on. Scotland and England never had such a thing. And I think that would be a very big thing to undertake. That was my prediction. And initially, after Brexit, I think once Brexit was voted for after the referendum, opinion polls and so on suggested that's going to be right. That there was a fall away in support for Scottish independence. That seems to have changed. and that's something we have to think about and decide how far that's going to continue. I think it's right to say, insofar as it has changed, it's not changed as a result of Brexit. I think we can argue about that, but the obvious circumstance which has changed it, if it has changed, is of course the present COVID crisis. And Scotland, as I said earlier, had always retained quite a lot of independent institutions, famous ones being the law, the church, so on. But actually, from the beginnings of the modern state's involvement with health, Scotland had also had what we would now call a devolved health service. In fact, I think the Scottish office was originally the Scottish Home and Health Office. So right at the beginning, health was separate. And when the modern NHS was created, straightforwardly, it was a separate organization in Scotland. Things like public health bodies were different and so on. So it was always, in effect, a separate country where health was concerned. Now, that didn't matter hitherto, because, of course, on the whole, people have been concentrating on questions of the economy, questions of movement of peoples, and so on this question of the nature of the British state and its relationship, the former relationship to the EU. We're now in a world where the only thing that matters is, or seems to matter, is medical services. That may be temporary. I fear a little bit that it may not be, actually. And of course, there is a certain reason why it may not be temporary, or at least why it may go much further into our political life than we would have imagined until the beginning of this year. Which is, traditionally the function of a state was to protect its citizens from armed attack and death, and it put an enormous amount of its budget into warships and armies and so on. Well, medicine on the whole didn't work, as we all know, down to the 1950s. It's pretty touch and go. But modern medicine does work, up to some extent anyway. And so it wouldn't be entirely surprising, even leaving aside COVID, for medical questions to become incredibly important in modern politics, just as defense questions used to be important in modern politics before the sort of international state system kind of seized up in various ways, at least among modern states. So, I wouldn't, as I said, I wouldn't bet necessarily on the present crisis just vanishing and people going back to thinking in the way in which they used to. On the other hand, it's not, again, there are many different openings here. I suspect, I would like to think, we will be back to the old way of thinking at some point. And if we go back to the old way of thinking, then I think the old logic between Scotland and England reasserts itself. Which is the idea of a Scotland, which is, let us imagine, part of the EU, and an England which is not. And although various people, I think, fantasize about Spain vetoing Scottish membership of the EU because they're scared of Catalonia making a bid for independence, my hunch is if the crunch came, that Scotland would be readmitted or admitted on new terms to the EU. I think that's quite likely. On the other hand, that really would mean some sort of serious border with England. Though it should be said on that matter that, again, what Pauline was saying is relevant, because to some extent, what happens in Ireland can be a template for a relationship between an independent Scotland and England. And I thought myself about the May withdrawal agreement, the original version, that it was something the SNP would be delighted about, because it showed how Ireland, the Republic of Ireland, could continue to have a very straightforward and pretty open border with England, if we're going to call it that, while being an independent country in the EU via the north of Ireland. And that's quite a powerful template for the SNP. So that we have this what I think I described in some piece I wrote as a sort of infernal machine that May invented, which the more the union with Northern Ireland was strengthened through that agreement, the more the union with Scotland was weakened. And I still think that's part of the logic of the situation. And the degree to which the Boris's government has backtracked away from that vis-a-vis Ireland will also, I think, if we stay within this form of logic, strengthen the union with Scotland. I mean, we can't have it both ways, I think. And I think for most of us, if there's a choice there, certainly from as far as I'm concerned, the union with Scotland is hugely important in many ways, not partly just in terms of, you know, the cultural and social life of the island of Britain, but particularly for left-wing politics, because as we all know, without Scotland, England would have a permanent Conservative majority. Well, it might have a sort of Starmer-esque Liberal Labour party, but I mean, fundamentally, it's going to have a Conservative majority. So that's, as I said, it would be nice if that were to happen. On the other hand, if we remain transfixed by the question of public health, how we deal with pandemics, etc., etc., it's certainly true that a degree of independence by Scotland is plausible. On the other hand, the EU ceases to look extraordinarily appealing in that situation. After all, the EU represents at the moment the two extremes globally of how the pandemic is being handled, from Sweden, which is the poster child for the liberal approach, to Spain or France, which are the opposite. And it's a little hard again to see how public health is going to encourage an independent Scotland to seek its fortunes in Europe. But I may be wrong about that. My hunch is that the union will persist. The SNP will do well, clearly. That Nicola Sturgeon has personally done very well. I think that's, incidentally, I think on that subject, which is interesting, a lot of people observe that female leaders around the world seem to have done better at handling the crisis. That may not be because they have been better in the sense of better policies. I don't think Sturgeon had very good policy, but because for a variety of reasons, they seem to have carried their populations with them. And that may be gender stereotypes. I don't know. There's all sorts of interesting things there, but it does seem to be a feature of female leaders. So in that sense, she's been lucky in leading Scotland during a medical crisis. Again, that popularity may diminish once we're past the crisis. Assuming that the union persists for the reasons I've been giving, that there's a sort of hard logic to the persistence of the union with Scotland, which I think there may not be at all, to the persistence of a union with Northern Ireland, for exactly the reasons that Pauline has adumbrated, although I don't know how we'd go on that. Assuming the union persists, then we should think about what kind of democratic structures could be introduced into a united kingdom of the island of Britain. And there I think that, I mean, my own inclination increasingly, to some extent, looking at what the aftermath of Brexit has been, is for ad hoc democracy. I mean, I've realized that in a way, it's going back to something a bit like what used to be called functionalism, something that Harold Lasky was principally associated with back at the beginning of the 20th century. But I was struck, I was reading recently for another purpose, a pamphlet that the young Dennis Healy wrote, explaining why Britain should not go into the coal and steel community, the forerunner of European Union. And he said that the problem would be, obviously, that it would then get some sort of, it's a huge block that would control British internal politics in a very wide variety of ways. But the correct way of thinking about European coordination was in terms of, indeed he used the term functionalism, specific things put under control in different ways. So you go sector by sector. And he also quoted the ILO, which worked a bit like that as a model. And I've begun to think that's actually quite a plausible model for democracy within the United Kingdom. That So that, for example, the idea that we should use the existing kingdom, Scotland and England, or Ireland, Northern Ireland if it stays in the Union, as, so to speak, the units, I'm not sure that's right. I mean, that was the Blair mistake about devolution, that something like democratic control of the principal social and economic structures, obviously health, obviously education, which I think most of us would think education should once again be put under the democratic control of the people whose children are going to be educated. I mean, the old ideal that goes back to the Middle Ages. We sort of forgotten, but it seems a very natural, obvious thing. Ditto with things like the national health, that it should be under more local and democratic control. And that would be true within the two kingdoms, as much so that you wouldn't have blocks based on the kingdoms. But do it, as I said, in a sort of ad hoc way, but consistently push in a more democratic direction when the question of the organization of these sorts of institutions comes up. So that insofar as we're asking some questions about what the nature of the British Constitution post-Brexit should be, my own proposal, my own view here would be a relatively unitary state. That is to say, don't go for federalism of a US type. I still live in the United States for, I've done for 25 years. The central problem with a strong federal structure is it gives enormous power to the juridical institutions which police the boundaries of the federation, Supreme Court. And that's a really risky thing, that's an anti-democratic route to go down. So I propose instead this sort of what I call kind of functionalist approach. So that would be my suggestion as an answer to the questions that we're dealing with.
Thank you, Richard. Peter Ramsay has dropped off. I'm sure he'll be back in a second. And we'll move on to Martin Loughlin, please.
Okay, thank you. Well, I want to take up the theme about the State of the Union by returning to the mantra of taking back control. I'm not suggesting for one moment that this is anything other than a rhetorical slogan, but I want to use it to throw into relief the constitutional challenges that we now face. Like many on the left, I had been quite content to live with the peculiarities of the British system of government, not least because it provided us with a simple, straightforward, and relatively transparent system of power and accountability through the House of Commons. But the changes that have been instituted since joining the European Union in 1973 have been so extensive and so deep that any sense of returning to the status quo ante is simple romanticism. And I suspect I'm going to slightly disagree with Richard on this solution, but let me explain why. In 1973, we had a parliament at Westminster that carried full authority to legislate for the entire United Kingdom. It had no rivals. We also had in Whitehall a government that possessed full and unrivaled authority to govern the entire UK. And I include in that statement Northern Ireland because at that point, the Stormont Parliament had been prorogued and a regime of direct rule from London had been established. And Richard is right about the Scottish office, but the Scottish office was only a system of administrative devolution. It had no legislative autonomy and no legislative authority. Indeed, it had to work within the parameters and the budget set by Whitehall. And that government and that parliament felt it had full authority to join the European Union by treaty and to pass the legislation needed to give legal effect to that. Now, our governmental arrangements at that time may have had their difficulties. We had huge departments of state overseeing public service provision through those nationalized industries that dominated the transport and energy sectors of the economy. But the accountability mechanisms, however inadequately they worked, the accountability mechanisms were still relatively clear. Furthermore, the system of local government was then in the process of being modernized with the establishment of a two-tier system and powerful agencies of local government throughout the main metropolitan areas. This system of local government, responsible for education, housing, public transport, personal social services, local economic development and such like, was of major constitutional importance. It accounted for over a quarter of total public expenditure. Now, this world has entirely disappeared. Privatization, deregulation, the adoption of market disciplines through competitive tendering regimes and such like have led to the creation of a highly fragmented system of government. It's destroyed entirely the idea of the self-sufficient local authority that's able to deliver public services to their local communities. It's resulted in a highly centralized regime, but it's a highly centralized regime in which the systems of control and accountability remain opaque to many. And yet, at the center, there's also a fragmentation of authority. Whitehall does not govern the United Kingdom any longer, not in the same way. There are rival governments in Wales and Scotland that now form a permanent part of the UK system of government. MPs may be elected from across the United Kingdom, but much of the legislation they're responsible for passing applies only to England. And much of the work of scrutiny of government departments is over English government departments. It's a haphazard system. At the same time, over this period, we've seen a decline in electoral turnout at parliamentary election, a decline in party memberships. I'm including the resurgence with Momentum and such like, a decline in the trust in MPs, an abdication by MPs of their lawmaking role by giving extensive discretionary secondary legislative powers to the executive, and a voluntary transfer of authority to the people through increasing use of referendums. The second chamber, meanwhile, is an absolute disgrace in a modern democracy. We've also seen a dramatic rise in the influence of the judiciary, not just through the Human Rights Act or the establishment of the Supreme Court, but also through the emergence of judicial review generally. The judiciary now is making a pitch. It's evident in the most recent prorogation case. It's now making a pitch to become the ultimate guardians of the Constitution. So even though Richard is saying, well, in a federal system, we're getting the emergence of juridical forms, we're already getting these in the British system. Exiting the European Union has meant the removal of a level of government that's unaccountable and opaque, and it's a system of government that's structured around ordoliberal disciplines. But the question still remains: what does taking back control mean with respect to the renewal of our own system of government? Now, the problem is that this is the question that none of the major political parties have sought seriously to address. The British political class seems unwilling and actually incapable of thinking systematically and creatively about what we must now call constitutional issues. You might say, the Johnson administration, elected in December 2019, pledged in their manifesto to establish a Constitution, Democracy and Rights Commission. Well, this seems to have been placed on hold, and it might never be launched. It's already been fragmented by establishing a little committee to deal with judicial review. And in any case, the issues on which it was likely to focus, fixed-term parliaments, prerogative powers, Human Rights Act, judicial review, these are simply responses to the government's recent frustrations. They don't go to the fundaments of the issue. And one can explain why, and the points have already been touched on by both Pauline and Richard. The basic reason is that the British Constitution has managed to float along in the modern era as a constitution without a subject. What is a constitution? Well, I'm not interested in the constitution of my tennis club or whatever. What is a constitution? The constitution is the constitution of a state. But what is a state? A state is an idea and an institution that conjoins territory, people, and a ruling authority. Yet, no one is able today to ask these basic questions. What is the territory of our state? Does it include Northern Ireland? Or are we talking about a British state in terms of the territory? I can give an answer to that, but I'm not going to give one now. What is the people? Is there a singular collective entity of the people any longer? This is the fragmentation problem of Scots, Wales, let alone Northern Ireland identity. Are our governmental arrangements fitted to the task of undertaking democratic renewal in the 21st century? Now, it's for all of these reasons that I think fundamental constitutional reform is absolutely required. I never believed it for quite a while, but I've come to the point of thinking this is the only way forward. The problem is that the British seem to be constitutional neophytes. They don't know how to think very sensibly and systematically about constitutional questions. And we see plenty of evidence of this in various exercises and so-called constitutional reform over the last few decades. But there's not much point in saying this, or indeed coming along and presenting blueprints, and I have ideas, and I do think federalism is the only way of sustaining the British state in the 21st century. There's not much point in coming along and doing this without being able to identify a political energy that is able to take this forward. And the tragedy is that we don't see this energy expressed through any of the main organizational forms of politics today. And while we lack that, we will just tinker with the superficial stuff and disintegrate. And on that happy note, I will conclude.
Thank you, Martin. Okay, so I'm afraid I had a technical collapse there in the middle, which is why I disappeared from your screens, which means I missed your conclusion, Richard, but I managed to get in. And also I have now a slightly strange combination of the Q&As. So I'm going to go back to the first question that was asked in the course of the your presentations was about the lockdown and civil liberties. I'm going to try and come back to that because I think that takes us slightly away. So that's Hal's question. I will try and get back to that. Maybe it'll come up. Another question that was asked earlier, which is a risky one to put to you, but I think I will do it just because I think it might be useful, was from Chris Gilligan, who asked, what do the speakers mean by sovereignty? The Good Friday Agreement, but before that the Anglo-Irish Agreement, blurred the question of national sovereignty by allowing the Irish government to say in governing Northern Ireland. Brexit has raised the issue of national sovereignty by taking back control from the EU. The problem for the UK is that it is both a unified state, the UK, and a union of 4 nations. Does Brexit not show that the demand for national sovereignty means that the union is politicised, the union itself? And this will continue to be an issue of instability, not only because of claims by Irish and Scottish nationalists, but also English nationalists. So anyone want to talk about, is that a problem? What do we mean by sovereignty? And is the union now just inevitably politicised by nationalists on all sides? Is English nationalism a problem? Any takers? Pauline. You need to unmute.
Yeah, I've done it there. That's great. The Good Friday Agreement is, I think I was trying to say, it is a settlement. It's very much a settlement, I think, of its time, in the sense that it has, in a sense, moved us all on from a very difficult problem, a problem of a dispute over national sovereignty, into a post-national world, if you like, or a set of arrangements. And I think we see my problem with it is not that that Northern Ireland has kind of transcended this conflict and achieved a kind of synthesis in a way of the 2 sides that were fighting each other. And in that sense, the conflict is sort of withering away, it's disappearing, it's not the big issue. And I think for many reasons the Good Friday Agreement is a very positive thing, and I think that probably accounts for its resilience, because it has created a space for people to just leave all that stuff at the door and engage with each other in a much more civil way. But my problem with it actually is that it's depoliticized, the union. That is actually my problem with it, because I think the union is a problem. I actually think that British rule in Ireland has been a disaster for British people, for the citizens of Britain and the people of Ireland. And so I don't see anything positive about Britain staying in any part of Ireland. When I say it's not, it's kind of created a sort of a sense or an illusion that everything is solved and that the heat has gone out of it, and the politics it's depoliticized it. But I think I referred before to yes, there's an invisible border, but of course it's not. It's a real border. It's a real border which is divides 2 separate jurisdictions and divides a people as well. But also these barriers within Northern Ireland, they're not invisible. They're very physical and very real. And there is, I think, a problem with what is sovereignty? Well, what I find very disturbing about the situation in post-agreement Northern Ireland is that there are parts of Northern Ireland where the state has effectively withdrawn and leaves matters to do with policing and what they call community policing to vigilante groups and former paramilitaries who carry out the functions of the state in the most brutal way, without any accountability, either through the law or politically. And so I think that sovereignty does matter, because for me, being clear about who is in charge and who governs is important, because for citizens it's important because they need to know where to go to make their demands or to hold people to account. So I think it doesn't help us. It helps in one way, but the price for me is too high for the depoliticization of the union.
Thanks, Pauline. Quickly, Richard or Martin, on that politicisation of the union. Richard, you're looking.
Yeah, I mean, I would just say that my own view about sovereignty is that it's an intensely pragmatic question. There's nothing sort of magical or spiritual or whatever about the nation of England or the nation of the United Kingdom. I think the question is, how do you maximize the sense of democratic agency? And if you have, and there's going to be a high degree of contingency there, because there are certain structures which have to some degree proved their utility. It's true that Martin said, well, it looks as if the old British Parliament hasn't done its job properly. On the other, we know how it works. We know how it did work. We know more or less what the levers are to pull to get at it, and there's some reasonable form of democratic control. And I think that there's a sense in which projects to create new nations, including the EU, are kind of utopian. They're trying to put in place things that haven't existed. Whereas, as I said, I think the correct way for Democrats to go is to be reasonably hard-headed and say, well, what actually are the institutions that we're familiar with, and we know more or less how to work, how can we use those for democratic purposes? So that would be my answer. I'm suspicious of national identity where it becomes detached from the real business of democratically based institutions, maximizing the agency of people who have to lead a common life together in the context of those institutions. I mean, that's roughly.
Thank you, Richard. Martin, anything to add at this stage? Oh, I've got Ella Whelan who wants to talk live, but Ella, can I just hold you for 1 second, because I realised as a good follow-up in the Q&A from two people to the discussion we've just had. So on the one hand, John Edwards asks, why don't we give maximum devolution to Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland and England? And that should remove the wish for independence, shouldn't it? So that's one question. And then another sort of, the question that comes at the same issue from the other end, from Richard Johnson. Devolution has contributed to the breakup of the union more than anything else. I don't understand why there is such a taboo in British politics with respect to reversing it. Even supposedly unionist parties constantly indulge separatism in a way in which few other countries would do. EU judicial supremacy was one challenge to the British Constitution, now happily reversed, but reversing devolution is the next step. Restore full power to the UK Parliament as the Parliament of all the people of this kingdom. Administrative devolution and no further. So there's the two balancing views. So maybe Martin, if I put that one to you first.
I would address it. I would address it the other way round. I would address it by saying, look, we've gone too far with Scottish devolution. The Scots don't regard themselves as being dependent on the Westminster Parliament for the source of their authority. I think you only have to spend time in Scotland talking to people there to realize how far they have gone. And we have to accept the reality of that. There is a viable Scottish Parliament, a viable Scottish government, a viable sense of a common political identity of the Scottish people, despite differences. And surprisingly, we are seeing it rapidly develop in Wales. Wales in 1998, when we established executive devolution only to Wales, there was a referendum on that issue. They passed by a bare majority of the Welsh people wanting this scheme, but now they've acquired more power. I think that this is a one-way track. And what I mean by approaching it the other way round is that we need to come clean and recognize that the Westminster Parliament is, and effectively always has been, an English Parliament, to which well, the English Parliament governed and legislated for England and Wales, but the Scots were invited by the treaty to come and join a parliamentary union. It wasn't a fully integrated state because they accepted that that law, education, and religion would be specially protected as distinctive forms of Scots political identity. So what we should do is, rather than think of it as devolution, we should think of it as evolution. And the evolution is that the Westminster Parliament re-emerges as an English Parliament. We abolish the House of Lords. They don't have a second chamber in Wales, and in Scotland we don't need one anyway. And what we evolve is a light federal structure that above this, that deals with foreign affairs, security, external relations, and budgetary matters. And so it's an evolution, not a devolution. And that's the only way forward. And we reconstruct it. They're talking about moving, we're talking about refurbishing the Palace of Westminster at huge expense. Just close half of it down, call it a museum, have a museum about the history of the British peoples or whatever, use the other half for a chamber. Instead of moving the Lords up to York, create a federal parliament in York.
Thank you. So, Richard, devolution or full devolution to England, or evolution or reassertion of Westminster?
Well, I've got a certain amount of sympathy actually with Richard Johnson's question. I should say on the question of Scottish identity, one point that we tend to forget, if the Scottish nationalists wanted independence now, they could have it exactly through the route that Sinn Féin took in 1919. In other words, their members at Westminster could simply not take their seats. And that was effectively the beginning of Irish independence. I've always thought that their unwillingness to go down that route shows that in some sense, they don't quite believe in their own independence, at least not in the way that the Irish clearly did. I mean, the Sinn Féiners knew what they were doing and they succeeded. And it's a natural way to succeed. But the Scots have never thought of going down that route. And it's one of what I think of many differences actually between Irish independence and the support for Irish independence and Scottish independence. They're not, I don't think they're quite the same sort of thing. So that's one of the things I would say about that. But I think Richard Johnson's point is well taken. I mean, the devolution has in a way begun to fracture the British state. And I would say to Martin, sort of sympathetic though I very much am, and he's easily the best spokesman for the views he's putting forward, I think what he is proposing goes even further, because I actually, as I said earlier, can't see how you have a light touch federalism without having some body, some sort of institution, which polices the relationships between the component parts. The American founders created such an institution, intending, as we all know, I mean, for the Supreme Court, really to be a kind of interstate court. But as we know, over the years, the Supreme Court becomes the key part, most of us would say, of the American state, as we can now see with what's going on after Ruth Ginsburg's death. So I think, given my deep fear of institutions like the EU, institutions like Supreme Courts, that acquire authority over people with virtually no democratic control. In the case of Supreme Courts, no democratic control. I'm anxious about federation. I don't see how you do that without having institutions of that sort, or you have an institution which really has power over the components of the federation, in which case all you've done is recreate a form of devolution. So I don't think that's going to be the solution. I have some sympathy with the idea of rolling back on devolution. I'm not sure Wales, actually. I mean, there's quite a powerful vote in Wales now, but a quarter quarter of the Welsh electorate, I think, want to get rid of the Welsh Assembly, don't you? I believe, on most opinion polls. My alternative would be what I suggested in my original remarks, which is a piecemeal. That it's only if we think about Scotland as a unitary state-like entity, Wales as a unitary state-like entity, England as a unitary state-like entity, and then we think, well, how do these entities relate to one another, that we get into this problem. If we think instead, well, local control of education, local control of health, more or less in a sense, what the Victorians envisage. And that's going to be true in the 3-component or even 4-component, whatever happens in Ireland, 3-component nations. You've lost a lot of, so to speak, the nationalist character of devolution, because you're getting a genuine local democratic control within the nations. So I think that's what I would say on that question.
Okay. Pauline, anything quick, but I'll move on. You're still muted, Pauline. You're still muted. That's
there we go. That's me. Yeah, a lot of the I think the way we think about, the way forward. Obviously, it's good to look back and see and look and think about things historically. Think about the different historical moments and so on, and how movements and ideas and systems and structures emerged from history at historical moments. But I think a lot of the ideas that we have, I mean, we collectively, when all of us talk about how to, the future and how to bring about democratic renewal, or indeed any kind of political discussion, it is always, I think, constrained and sort of almost, reactive in a sense to what seems possible today. And it seems that the fragmentation of society and the atomization of citizens and this erosion and hollowing out of authority. When you talk about, or we talk about devolution or taking back local democracy, local democratic control and so on, you have to check yourself and say, actually, the local democratic institutions are empty, they're hollow, they're broken, they're not connected to anything, they have nothing inside them. Many of the devolved administrations, certainly in Northern Ireland, it's an empty shell. It doesn't even take itself seriously. It's mostly lurches from crisis to inertia. And I think it's this awful kind of reactive crisis and inert quality of contemporary politics, which is a problem. And so for me, really fundamentally, it is about it's not about changing or reconfiguring relationships and structures. It's actually a real problem of building a sense of solidarity with each other and a sense that we can change things, that things can be changed and that we can make a difference. And that's such a basic building block of democracy that you kind of can't go anywhere without that. You just end with a further kind of reconfiguration of existing structures that aren't really they don't really work anyway.
Thanks. Okay, so Ella Whelan has been waiting patiently to ask a question live with a human voice.
Hi, thanks. Really interesting discussion. I suppose it was just following on from something that Pauline just said, and also the points that she was making. I mean, Pauline, you're completely right to say that, in many cases there's nothing or very little exciting in movements or political trends towards pretenses at sovereignty, whether it be sort of Sinn Féin talking about a border poll, but only in the context of being pro-EU, or the SNP's approach to independence. But I suppose the only thing that I keep thinking is, if we are to learn a lesson from the Brexit referendum in the UK, It's that if you wait, like I think many on the British left did, until the circumstances exactly fit your sentiments, like, people being very self-conscious about calling it Lexit instead of Brexit and all these kinds of things, and holding back until the time is exactly right and everything fits into place, you often miss the boat. And I would be much more open, I think, to being experimental with movements, even if they are as ridiculous as what's going on in the question of Irish unity at the moment, or the Irish Times constantly posting sort of rather excited polls about how many Catholics there are in terms of population growth in the north, as if it was just a case of numbers. But in a world in which any kind of shake to the status quo is to be benefited, shouldn't we sort of be more bending the stick in the way to ride the wave, a bit like how lots of us rode the wave with the Tories, or indeed the Brexit Party, or whatever kind of organisation it was that you think is behind the mainstream Brexit vote, and see what happens. I just think that I sort of agree with everything you're saying, but I'd be more willing to say, well, screw it, let's see where it goes, and be on the side of arguments for the splintering of the union, just because it could provide some sort of exciting opportunities for us to deal with the chaos that it will cause, but in a positive way.
Thanks. Any takers? Should we just ride the wave of disintegration and see what we can make of it? If in there you can recover the sense of a subject to, if not the constitution, at least some constitutions.
I'd like to hear what Pauline has to say in answer to that, because it was, I mean, clearly that's the setting in which some of these issues are most immediate.
Yeah, I actually do agree, Ella, to a large extent. But I'm very sympathetic what you're saying. I think that I would think it would be a great thing if there were people, and I'm sure there are people, but if they could get together in Ireland and in the north and actually start and there's been lots of, actually, that I'm saying if only, but there are actually lots of really interesting political movements that have actually come along in the north and in the south as well, and lots of young people have got involved, and so there is actually quite a lot of interesting and potentially transformative politics going on. And I'd said, and I think that it is a problem that imaginatively we're sort of constrained in what is, and what is extraordinarily narrow and constricting. And things like the Good Friday Agreement settlement is actually a really a straitjacket, an imaginative straitjacket, and structurally so, and people just move around in this narrow space, and so yes, anything that kind of upsets that and springs people out of that. The problem is, though, that actually it was unsettled, and the Brexit vote unsettled it, and yet there it is, resilient as ever. And what I think has been revealed is, it's not about numbers of people, or it's not about just lots of excited people wanting change or yearning for change. We really need to actually have a sense of what it is we want, what we're doing it for, and where it's going. And I think we have to build some structures too to get there. Otherwise, it just seems to be so much froth and not enough muscle to actually make a change. And I think the one last thing is, the problem is, if you just get constant recurring attempts at things, and then defeats, and then more attempts, and then further defeats, and everything becomes kind of dispersed and confused, I think it's very bad because I think it's a bad thing. I think people just kind of give up and it's kind of demoralizing. So I think we have to be very careful and choose battles very carefully.
Okay, I'm going to take two questions from the floor, as it were, live. But I would ask you both to be really quick now, because you know we're running along. So if you could ask your questions quickly. First to Alex Harris. Alex.
Hi there. I was picking up a point really some of the panelists have made in terms of how we take this further now, and it's particularly sort of extending our democracy. And I feel that a habit we're sort of making now is to think within the structures we've already given. An example of that is we're talking about devolution. I'm obviously Welsh, and I've sort of lived within a devolved government in Wales for some time. And that's all really that happens, is that it just shifts a centralised system down a notch. And so I just wonder now whether we need to start thinking sort of outside of those governmental structures, where, you know, to take from maybe the early Labour movement, where we take more of democratic interest in our institutions and how they become accountable to us, and almost begin democratizing from the bottom up, as opposed to the top down, which I think we constantly think of claiming our democracy from the top and allowing those structures to filter the democracy through. And I just wonder, you know, particularly I know people like Maurice Glassman have talked about this, where taking a much greater interest in how we have greater democracy within institutions, which will actually create a level playing field across all four nations, because then we have a combined interest, and it maybe starts to break up this narrative of government, of central government, because whether we like it or not, Holyrood and Cardiff and Westminster, they all share that value, if you like. So I just wonder what maybe the panelists' thoughts were on that.
Thanks, Alex. And Chris, if you could be quick to Chris Gilligan, please. Hello.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Right, great. I think Martin summed up the issue really well when he said we have a constitution without a subject. I think that's what a lot of the discussion has been around. But I think that it seems to be problematic, the way in which the discussion is going in terms of how do you bring a subject into being. The way that Richard Tuck is talking seems to be thinking of Brexit as nudge, change the choice architecture, and that will bring a subject into being or make it easier. To me, a subject has to be someone who's moving rather than someone who's made to move, so that it's not about the architecture. And Pauline suggests that what we need to do is build a sense of solidarity. And I think that's probably true, or that's certainly part of the issue, or the part of the way forward. But I think if we say that, then we'd have to say that Brexit has actually created a lack of solidarity, or has been really divisive. It's been divisive within the UK, it's been divisive between the parts of the UK. And so in terms of solidarity, how do we build up a sense of solidarity? I think it's worth looking at where there are people who are active subjects, where there is activity going on. So Pauline talked about in Ireland. I think if we look at the campaigns around the referendum, the abortion referendum, around the referendum on gay marriage, that shows active subjects who are attempting to remake society. We haven't got anything like that in the UK or anything on that scale, but there are things going on in the UK that are encouraging, like the Black Lives Matter protests that surprised me with the scale of them across the UK and the number of them that erupted spontaneously. Okay. There's interesting things happening in terms of the small independent unions, the ones that are more self-organized, like the IWW, the IWGB, the Bakers Union. So it seems to me that the question should be looking at where is the active subject that can remake a constitution rather than the other way around. How do we create a constitution that makes an active subject?
Okay, thanks. So there's really both questions tending in the same direction. Isn't this a bit too top down, talking about the architecture, when what we need is to go to the bottom up if we want to fill the constitution with some subjective spirit? Richard, Martin first, or Pauline, and any, you want to come back on either of those, any of that?
Yeah.
You're muted, Martin.
Martin?
Okay. I agree entirely with the sentiments of both Alex and Chris about the necessity of building from the bottom up. It's easy to talk the language of solidarity, but as Chris rightly says, the Brexit referendum actually was divisive. And here, although I'm a supporter of the full Brexit, I actually was opposed to the holding of the referendum at that moment, because it wasn't a constitutional moment, and it seemed to me it was going to split 50-50. I didn't know which way around, but I knew it would be 52-48. That was the one thing I think I probably got right, even though I didn't know which way around it would be. And first, Alex makes a really good point about going back. I know the world is entirely different to 100 years ago, but think about it. And Richard touched on this when he referred to Harold Laski and his functionalism. When we go back to the emergence of democracy with respect to the British state, there was a huge amount of energy from Lasky, from GDH Cole. Richard wasn't around at the time, unfortunately, but the Webbs in the 1920s wrote an entire book called A Constitution for a Socialist Commonwealth of Britain, and had imaginative ideas about functional representation through parliaments, not simply constituency representation. And this is very much Cole's Guild socialism, and in a sense, what Alex was alluding to, the use of alternatives like citizens' assemblies, or trying to rekindle the sense of guild socialism that Cole and Lasky started talking about, are ways of trying to engage from the bottom up. But to be realistic about it, the problem is that there are sparks all around, but the world in which we live is not conducive to building the biggest scale of social and political solidarity that we need. So I do think that it can't be just one way, and it's not just top down. Top down won't work. It'll be technocratic. It can't be just bottom up, because those movements need institutional and resource support, and that can only come from formal institutionalized governmental arrangements. And that's why I decry the destruction of a system of local government, which is effectively what has happened over the last 30 years. That's why I said it's the end of the self-sufficient local authority. The idea that the local authority was an agency that was a representation of the local community, and I don't want to suggest that there's a great communitarian spirit here, but that if a properly resourced local agency can support these movements, then they will be assisted to flourish. But it needs that formal institutionalized structure in order to assist with that.
Thanks,
That's all I'll say.
Could I come in on this too? Because I think it's a hugely important set of questions. I mean, Chris in a way was right in accusing me of a picture of nudging. But the reason for that is this, and I can use the referendum, the Brexit referendum, as an example. I think the Brexit referendum, calling the referendum, created a democratic moment. I think it created, for all its failings, quite an impressive kind of public debate, and a lot of people began to think in different ways about what they wanted, and they acted on it. Now, that wasn't exactly bottom up. I mean, it was a decision to give a particular, if you like, institutional shape to something, and people took advantage of it. And that roughly is my view, actually, about democracy. I think if you have the right structures in place, people will use them. People want to take part in democratic politics. They wanted to use local government, but local government, as Martin absolutely rightly said, had all its powers gradually taken away against the wishes, in almost all cases, I should imagine, of the local residents. This was an extremely anti-democratic process, Thatcher above all doing that. So that the nudging in that sense, possibly, I'm not sure that the bottom-up or top-down models are quite right, because top-down doesn't have to be technocracy. Top-down could be a decision by the British state to reintroduce these sorts of democratic institutions at the local level. People will then use them. I think that would be my principal answer to Martin. On the other hand, if one's going down that route, then one does have to take seriously the question of equalizing among these institutions, which is what to some degree killed local government. And again, if you use the American example, America has quite a high degree of local democracy, famously. On the other hand, it also has a very high degree of difference in wealth and resources between the local cities or areas. How you solve that seems to me the central problem of democratizing the key institutions of our society. How you, because money is going to be an incredibly important aspect of this, how you have local democratic control over budgets without ending up with enormous disparity of resources. And the logic of the loss of local democracy has been precisely whoever organizes the distribution of money in the end claims, not unreasonably, to have the authority. That if we can solve that, I think we can do a great deal in democratizing.
Pauline, you might want to come in, but just before you do, I just want to throw in another question, which I think arises in the same discussion, which is Chris asks, is the lack of creativity thinking around constitutional issues amongst the political classes simply a temporary fallout of being in the EU for 40 years, or something more deeply historically rooted in the British context, or something to do with a representation of modern capitalist technocracy? How deep rooted is this problem that we have? But Pauline, sorry, I jumped in and I just want to stick that out there.
No, I think that's a really good way into thinking about this. I mean, I tried to look at the problems that we're facing. I think one thing we're all agreed on is that that we've got problems, and that the problem is connected to, or it arises from, a diminished sense of political agency, whether it's at citizen level or at level of, in our relationship to the state, and even to one another, and also from the top down, a diminished sense of authority and a failure to act when it's necessary, or to take responsibility. And this, I think, yeah, Peter, what I was trying to say in my introduction really was that all of this has very complex. Some of it's historical, some of it's like it's always been this way, or it's simply a continuation of problems that we had before. But the kind of, I think the length of time between, say, the decline of what you might call the welfare state, the British welfare state, which was set up then, after the war, which was a kind of a change. It was a structural and a political change that occurred. It was almost like the beginning of a new kind of a set of arrangements for citizens being together and for their relationship to the state. But that decline, which I guess you could sort of say somewhere around the mid-70s, it started to decline. The decline has gone on for so long without anything actually coming in to take its place. to say, what is it that we want to do? What will be the basis of our solidarity with each other? What is it that we, as people who happen to be in this place together, what is it we want to do together? And I think that's, you know, that's a world historical problem. It's not just a problem for the people of Britain, it's a problem for everybody in the world. How will we live together, and how will we cooperate with one another? And why I think democracy and sovereignty are important is that if we don't ask those questions, and I'm totally with Alex and Chris on it, you know, it has to be us that does it, because it has to come from the bottom up. If we don't ask these questions, we cannot rely on those who are already in charge now to change anything. Why would they? And I think the example of Britain's government in Northern Ireland is a, you know, a real cautionary tale of how actually power can be wielded without responsibility and without authority, and where the state in question and those in power really don't care. They're just not interested in finding resolutions or in making people's lives, improving people's lives. So I think it's important that we do take this question to heart. On the question of starting from the bottom up, however, why would we dismember ourselves first? I have got lots of contacts. I mean, I'm part of the same political community as the people in Whitley Bay and Durham, and actually in Scotland too at the moment still. And I'm part of that political community. Why would I want to break that up and just go and start from scratch somewhere else? So I think that the national political community, to me, is as good a place as any to start. And it's one where there are structures and where there is a sense of solidarity. If Brexit was divisive, well, you know, political change, politics is divisive, and people get upset when people have different ideas about how we should govern ourselves. But we just have to get over that and work through it. And I think the most destructive thing about Brexit, I have to say, and I don't want to go back into this all over again, was the response to it from those who wanted to maintain the status quo, who didn't want to talk about it and didn't want to engage in any discussion of political change, but wanted to confine everybody to their political interests and didn't want to listen to the people in Whitley Bay or Hartlepool. So I think we have to both think from the bottom up of how we change ourselves and those close to us and around us, and how we argue for change. But we have to think of it also in bigger contexts and in national and international contexts as well. So it's not easy, it's complicated, but it does start with just asking questions of each other.
And so I take it from what you've just said, Pauline, it could be in answer to Liz's question in the Q&A, how do we persuade the politicians to open up a serious debate on some of the issues raised here, that we probably can't persuade the politicians to open it up? Would that be that we open it up or it doesn't happen?
I think that's what Martin was saying as well, wasn't it? I'm going to turn the light on. It's getting darker and darker in here. Just a sec.
Getting darker and darker out here too. Is that right? Is that question's asked, Richard and Martin? Is that where we're at? We're not really going to persuade our existing political parties as they currently stand to engage in a serious discussion on this. Either we start it or people outside of the formal party system start it, or it doesn't happen.
Well, I had hoped after the referendum that the sense that people had that they could change the conditions of their life through voting would go over into other things. And I agree with Pauline that the thing that may have checked that was the sort of resistance, the muddy character of the politics that followed the vote. I think I'm still optimistic on the whole that people did get that sense of agency for a moment, and they will not permanently, or perhaps not even for very long, be checked in the desire to apply it to other areas of their lives. But that's, maybe I'm just whistling in the wind. I mean, that would be my hope. I mean, people have an example of what can be done however difficult it is to implement, it has been implemented, sort of, for all its sort of, the qualifications. And that's an important lesson. And I think eventually, I mean, it's not going to happen very fast, maybe, but I think eventually this is a lesson that is going to have to be applied, necessarily will be applied in other areas of people's lives.
Okay, Martin?
I'm a bit more skeptical than Richard because it was a single issue on, I mean, a profoundly important issue, but a single issue on which they expressed a yes/no preference, and it's difficult to build a common solidarity on the broader issues around that question. It's not impossible, but it requires work. And what's most depressing, I suppose, is the state of the Labour Party. I think that they just, I don't care what the policy, I mean, I'm not talking about the particular policies. I just mean they don't seem to have their act together. They haven't thought through seriously the types of governmental challenges that we are now facing and the opportunities and the potential that they might have for real rejuvenation. But other than, I mean, what is the purpose of the political activity? It's not all focused on a parliamentary politics, to be sure, but if the Labour Party isn't interested in trying to win power, then what does it exist for? And without some, it's very easy to be critical of the parliamentary road to socialism, of whatever one might call it. And indeed, Ralph Miliband produced a book entirely criticizing that. But what's the alternative? A violent revolution? Well, I don't see the troops coming over the hill. So somehow we have to try to build these structures of solidarity, and we have to use institutional structures in order to achieve certain gains. But sorry, I'm beginning to sound rather pessimistic because
I'm now going to return to round off the discussion to, I think, what was probably the first question asked in the Q&A by Hal, which in many ways, if you thought your comments there were depressing, puts us into the even more depressing context of the lockdown or the restrictions, the COVID restrictions. Hal asked, is there a potential for a left anti-lockdown position or a place where civil liberties and freedoms can be maintained alongside democracy and social services? And it's striking to me that the Brexit vote produced, or the Brexit process produced this extraordinary general election last year, which was a major turning point in the history of British party politics, probably. One which did, as Phil Cunliffe has argued, really did show that working class voters were biddable, and suddenly, puts political accountability back into the frame. As I said at the beginning, a Tory party that's suddenly concerned about state aid, that has a position to the left of Blairism. So that happened. We left the European Union a month later, or 6 weeks later, and then within weeks, politics is off. Then we spent, and I'm not being a conspiracy theorist, COVID's real and all the rest of it, but it is extraordinary that at that moment that politics, I got the strong sense from Remainers that one of the things they didn't like about Brexit was that politics was back. And suddenly politics was, and then suddenly, wham, 6 months, politics has been off. So what are your thoughts about this in the COVID context? If any? It's difficult, but is there a connection that we should be thinking about? Because as you said, Richard, this may not go away. There may be no return to normal. Any takers?
Who do you want first? I think we've probably all got views on that. Shall I go?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, look, okay, first question. What would a democratic response to COVID look like? I don't think any countries in the world has done it. And by that, I don't mean just following opinion polls or focus groups. I mean actually getting people to make concrete decisions about what the conditions under which they're going to live in the situation should be. And as we know, when people actually have to make a decision, not just give some vague opinion to a pollster, they're going to, they may surprise us in what they decide to do, just as they did in the case of Brexit. And I think that's, it's really a key feature of democratic politics. If you actually think you are in some sense participating in making a real and responsible decision, so you're like, Weber's politician governed by the ethics of responsibility rather than the ethics of conviction, then you've got to think responsibly, and thinking responsibly means bringing in all the considerations about economic damage as well as the public health question. So that would be my first question. Let's just imagine that. And why has virtually no country in the world done that? Why have we reverted to a sort of medieval assumption that a public health emergency means the end of democracy, particularly as actually modern technology would permit the continuation of certain kinds of democracy? And I think Parliament set an extraordinarily bad example by its cowardice in the face of this thing. And well, you have said that yourself, Peter, I think, in print. But whether it's possible, I don't know. I mean, well, obviously, I think it's technically possible and morally possible. Whether it's politically possible, given the feebleness, again, of the Labour Party in this respect, which has basically just gone along with the government. In fact, it'd probably like a little bit more diminution of civil liberties rather than less. I don't know. I mean, I'm pessimistic on that front, to be honest. But we should struggle. We should try and make this sort of point.
Okay, Martin.
Well, it's rather surprising that the Supreme Court regarded the 3-week prorogation as an attack on the fundamentals of our democracy, when Parliament itself closed itself down for a month or more, didn't even think of imaginative ways of keeping in existence to try to hold government to account, and indeed passed an incredibly elaborate Coronavirus Act in one day that gave extraordinary powers to government to legislate through executive legislation without any recall, scrutiny, accountability. And I have no idea what a left response to coronavirus would be, but I do think that we have fudged, the government and Parliament has fudged this distinction between the regulations, which are law, and the guidance, which are advice. And the police agencies have fudged this too. Well, Peter and Phil and Lee wrote about this on the Full Brexit website very convincingly. But we don't have to have imaginative responses to what a left coronavirus response is. We just want our parliamentarians to do the job for which they've been elected and paid, and that is to scrutinize, hold government to account, and try to ensure that the powers that they are conferring on them are necessary and are subject to controls and accountability and scrutiny.
Thanks. Pauline.
I think that I think as if we needed reminding that the COVID crisis has really hammered home just how fragile our democracy is, and our at local level, how centralized decision making is, and how weak decision making is. Either now, even just among citizens, not even in in our institutions, and not even just in our political institutions, but our cultural institutions. You know, everything just closing and shutting down. And I think the sense of being literally trapped inside, closed, shut away from other people, is overwhelming at times. And it's poignant. It's really sad that, I mean, whether you are a Brexit supporter, or whether you were supporting knocking on doors because you wanted Jeremy Corbyn elected, so you were kind of a left revivalist, a popular left revival, wherever you're coming from, that moment when things would just seem to be getting exciting again, has just dissolved into nothing. And I think, what would a democratic response be, and what would a left response be, a socialist response be? Well, first of all, I think it would be to call for some kind of collective, voluntary action. It would be even a liberal democracy would say, come along, citizens, get involved, join up and do your bit. So there would be a collective call to action. It would be about not locking yourself away to save yourself, but if you were well and fit and young, to get out there and help people who are vulnerable. And the fact that it's actually been the opposite of this is very telling. And not just from the centralized political machine, but also, trade unions, all sorts of membership associations and so on, are actually not inviting their members to get involved, to take part. I think it's also very interesting, however, that actions which are in a sense more fragmentary, or are against something, or are a kind of negative response, are more in evidence. So I think some of, say, the attacks on statues and so on, which I actually thought were not the kind of thing that I want to see in the middle of a health emergency where, hundreds of old people's lives are at risk. I'd rather see people, if they're going to come together collectively to do something positive, rather than just being against something. And I think, using the opportunity rather just to get in there and have their moment on the stage. So I'm not really that excited by the idea of an anti-lockdown movement or joining in that. I'd much rather see a pro-voluntary collective action movement. And I'm shocked, actually, and I'm shocked at myself as well, that I'm not doing more. That I'm doing stuff, but I'd like to be part of a great group of people who were out there, doing things that were positive. And I know at the beginning there was a call for that, but it just dissipate so quickly. So that's what I would like to see. I think it can be done. I think it's something that we can do. But it's very telling that it isn't coming. It's definitely not coming down from on high, is it?
And it might be the experiment that might put the subject back into the Constitution. Yeah. Thank you very much, everyone. With that, we've gone on till 7:30. I hope it's been interesting. My apologies to everybody who couldn't get in, I couldn't take your questions. We'll be returning to this subject, the subject of the Constitution in the future, I'm sure, and there is going to be a bit more Brexit water to flow under the bridge in the next few months, and we'll definitely be talking about that. So I'd like to thank our panelists for doing the work, virtual round of applause, and look forward to seeing you again at a future event. And do get in touch with the Full Brexit, follow us on Twitter, or get in touch with us at the website if you've got ideas for future things. And I think we'll take Pauline's, maybe we should take Pauline's good advice with us going forward and bring some more light on the situation. Thanks, everybody. See you later.